Class, this week we're continuing our focus on classical organizational theorists, but primarily what does it mean when the scholars this week talk about the one best way for efficiency and effectiveness and to be the most productive in a public sector agency. So just a couple quick reminders. Don't forget this week you're supposed to email me which agency you're going to select. So we talked about that last week, but make sure that you send that to me if you have any questions about it. But this is going to set up what you're going to do for that first assignment. So again, make sure in the appendices it's clearly laid out what I'm looking for, which is due next week, that understanding organization assignment number 1. So looking at the mission statement, what are some of the arguments for and against this mission statement, and how can you use the theorists that we've talked about so far to examine this mission statement analysis. Some feedback overall for your critical outline assessments. I really want to again zero in on the purpose of these. It's not to make you feel agitated or to regurgitate the readings. I really want us to move beyond description and to provide what is the argument for each of these scholars, just really briefly. You shouldn't spend more than a couple, one sentence for each. Use that sample. What are the connections? What critiques do you have in questions? Double space, 2 pages. This is really pushing you to be clear and concise, which is one of the fundamental aspects, is that we're trying to inform students to become in line with national competencies for Masters of Public Administration programs. Our goals for this week is again looking at that concept of man as a machine, so that classical theory metaphor. What are some of the basic assumptions of each of the classical theorists? How does Woodrow Wilson try to challenge the way of thinking for classical organization theorists? And then this notion of one best way, is it really realistic for organization theorists, or even a forward-thinking approach for future public organizations or current public organizations? So I want you to think about, in your career or in your experiences as a student. So I know some of you are currently students that are in your public service or nonprofit profession, but some of you are also just students that might not have a full-time job, which is completely fine. And that's one of the best things about a Masters of Public Administration program, is that we're learning from each other. So some new things for maybe folks that might not be as seasoned, or some really effective scenarios or hands-on learning experiences for those of you that have been in a current position for a while. But think about who you've had that has been a good manager or a bad manager. And think about what type of structures they put forward, the types of communication that they provide, and what they've done that has been good and what they've done as bad. And in thinking about that, I want you to think about how that links back to these basic assumptions as man as a machine. So the idea is that you depoliticize the agency. Your focus is to increase productivity. It's a closed system, meaning that you're really focused on communication with inside the organization, and it's very top down. So you don't have an opportunity for feedback to flow from the top of the organization to the bottom and vice versa. So closed system. And really focusing on the effectiveness of operations. So maybe you've had someone that you've worked for in the public sector that sees some of these basic assumptions and looking at the machine model of public organizations. But then think about the basic assumptions of Smith's work and Taylor and Weber and Gulick. So think about how they're all building upon each other and thinking about that one best way. So productivity, the structure and hierarchy. And so think about how maybe that still carries on, those traditions carry on today. This is an excerpt of Frederick Taylor's training manual. And so think about what this means and whether or not you're a high-priced man. So thinking about shoveling and loading that pig iron and shoveling coal. And so what does this mean? Do you want to make more? Do you value this notion of a high-priced man? What does this mean? And so think about how this plays back into these basic assumptions or driving elements, and thinking about public organizations or organizations more broadly as a machine. What questions does this raise? And ultimately, this brings us to Woodrow Wilson's work, is how can we make public organizations better? So he talks about using information from businesses to enhance our practices, just like Taylor and Smith and Weber. But also he wants to make sure that we're separating politics and administration, so that politics-administration dichotomy. And that as public administrators, we are value neutral. The decisions that we make, we are setting aside our biases because we are serving the public, versus value laden, where we are inserting our biases in making decisions. So think about how Wilson tries to challenge this and making sure we are making the best decisions that we can. So ultimately, what questions do you have? Think about what questions you can use to raise in the discussions for this week. Looking at pages 11 and 12 of the machine and Moodle reading, what critiques do you have of the classical approach? Is the best approach, or is this thinking of the one best way the most effective, the most productive in moving forward for public organizations? Or why does this serve as a foundation? Are some of these elements still predominant in public organizations today?